beer. From very, very early time when we got grain and some of it went rotten and somebody liked the taste or the smell or the feel of what happened, ever since then, people whose system is shocked by, destroyed by, ruined by alcohol tend to die off more often, tend to have more problems living in our society. People who are deathly allergic to alcohol, for example, those genes are selected against because alcohol has been everywhere with us for thousands and thousands of years. Used to be it was the only safe drink for a long time. I mean, it's got alcohol in it. It sort of purifies itself. Used to be it was the only safe drink, and peasants in medieval Europe would get up in the morning and have a jug of cider, and they would drink it all day long. And probably drunk by mid-afternoon, but what the heck, they're not very productive, doesn't matter. And we've evolved in that sense. Nowadays, probably less alcohol is drank by people in general than in a long, long history. Like I said, it used to be about the only safe thing to actually drink, even though it does dehydrate you. No wonder these people died at the age of 20 or 30 or whatever. Alright, on to what they call the social results. If the winter rains failed, a village might get no crops. Some settlements seem to have tried farming and then given up the effort because of local problems in adapting crops, or for whatever reason. They were invaded, there was a war, plague, superstition, a religious revival. Something made them give up farming. It's happened for long periods in some places, then disappears, and then comes back later. Continuing. Still, the facts that men also continued to hunt, fish, and gather wild nuts, berries, and other objects may have been a sufficient safeguard to ensure against real disaster. So we weren't able to get off onto really being able to support ourselves completely by agriculture for quite a while. And during that time, famine would have been less disastrous than what we think of it later, when there's just no chance people can go out and hunt and gather any food for, when whole huge massive cities go hungry. And then people just die in droves by the tens of thousands. It's just how it happened. And back here, when farming villages are 100, 150 people, you would have occasional droughts and starvation, but not of the massive degree that you're able to get later when we depend on agriculture for the entire diet. Continuing. On the whole, agricultural life became far more secure and orderly. The increased variety and quantity of physical objects made this possible. How the first farmers in the Near East came to tame either plants or animals remains a matter of guesses. We might suspect that food-gathering people had occasionally stored their surplus grain, and they came to speculate on the fact that some reserves sprouted in storage. Women probably did most of the grain collecting, but the rise of agriculture certainly did nothing to help raise the position of women. On the contrary, I put this in, I was going to strike it because it was sort of nonsense, but it's a good point, because those of you who have been to college and studied anthropology all in college, you know that anthropology in college is sort of touted as up until we discovered farming, everybody was equal. Those ancient societies were egalitarian. They had no class. They had no wealth. Old and young, men and women, sick and healthy, everybody was completely equal. And that's nonsense. Here's a reasonable view of it. On the contrary, in the civilized societies which followed upon the early villages, masculine dominance seems firmly established as an ancestral pattern. In other words, it's not something that just popped up with farming. It's an extremely old pattern that goes back a very great deal of time. Continuing, another result of agriculture, of villages, of town life, another result was a considerable increase in the population. Settlements the size of Jericho and Çatalhöyük had never existed before. Pause for just a second here. I mentioned there must have been a time, I mentioned this earlier, possibly in this series, possibly in another, there must have been a time when people just looked around them and said, this is different. My grandparents never talked about anything like this. My great-grandparents never talked about anything like this. I never heard about anything like this. People living in the same place constantly and growing food in fields, for a good part of their diet. I never heard about this before. There must have been a time when people said, this is a change. You know, and it took brave people to do it. In part, this increase was the result of what seems clearly to have been a somewhat better chance that children would survive to maturity. That seems likely. You know, you're not moving around and stuff constantly. You've actually got a home that you can live in permanently. Possibly lower the likelihood of childhood death. Continuing, partly it was the consequence of increased food supplies. Early farming, however, was a very primitive culture with digging sticks and hoes. Animal power was not hitched to a plow until the 4th millennium BC. So for a couple thousand years they went on without animal power, and eventually they're like, why don't we get them to do some of this? It's another 6,000 years later, in Russia, in the early 1900s, women pulled plows sometimes. Continuing, yields were probably not more than 4 or 5 grains of wheat or barley for every grain which was planted. It's much, much higher than that today. The evidence of the Tehucan Valley in North America may warn us not to exaggerate the rate of population growth. In the Near East, the great expansion of the population occurred after men had moved down into the fertile river valleys. Farming settlements were much more consciously organized and interconnected. From the situation at the beginning of historical times, one may infer that authority lay with the elders of each village, who applied tribal tradition to the conduct of daily life. Yeah, that's much more reasonable than that they were all completely equal. Individual independence of action must have still been a virtually unknown concept, and men worked together with a close-knit society. One of the earliest... Now, pause here. I mentioned that it's been said that the rise of civilization was the rise of privacy. And Greece was not quite so private as the Renaissance was able to give men. And the Renaissance, not so much privacy was allowed as the 1800s, and the 1800s, the 1900s, and the 1900s, the late 1900s, and we're shutting some of that off. You're not allowed your private beliefs and views so much anymore. We're shutting that off. That's scary. But anyways, so privacy is equivalent to civilization. Continuing, one of the earliest villages in Egypt even had a communal granary, pits in the grounds lined with coiled basketry. Now, I've heard all kinds of interpretations of that and other supposed communal granaries. That they shared everything? Less likely than that the workers who did the grain were forced by soldiers or whatever to harvest the grain and give it to the whole town, and everyone was portioned and rationed. The reason that civilization hasn't handed itself down to us is because it's not successful. Continuing, each early farming village was virtually self-sufficient. Nevertheless, its inhabitants were linked to the physical and spiritual world which lay about them. I pause to say they are self-sufficient in the sense that they can produce most of what they really need there in the village. But things that they don't need but are nice, luxuries, trinkets, beads, shells, decorations, ceremonial medals, these types of things were bought over great, vast distances, hundreds and hundreds of miles even back then. The fact that the citizens of Jericho felt compelled to devote very extensive labor toward walling themselves is significant. It just means that people attacked people, and these people try to do something about it. More peaceful connections with outside tribes were attested by the presence of foreign objects and materials, such as the discovery of obsidian and cowrie shells at Jericho. Now, just because they built a wall, he seems to imply that by the fact they built a wall means they were cutting themselves off from the rest of society. No, building a wall made them a stable, productive place, which would give them even more connections with the societies around them through trade and domination. So, just a bit of backward thinking on the part of this gentleman, or perhaps other people, Mr. Starr. By 4000 BC, the spread of ideas and the example of pottery designs can be traced over hundreds and hundreds of miles in the Near East and even farther. Now, on to the spread of agriculture. Once the domestication of plants and animals had begun, men seem to have needed time to become accustomed to their great achievement in the Near East, as they did in the Tehucan